One of the questions I get asked is, well, Forrest was really effective, did a lot of things, but it was always away, or almost always away from the main armies. So, really, what difference did he make in the larger scheme of the war itself? Or did he make a difference? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on his whole military career and a little background on himself, but I will emphasize those points where I believe he actually made a difference in the overall conduct of the war. So, just to start off, he was born in Chapel Hill in 1821. Chapel Hill, Tennessee is actually only 60 miles north of where I'm sitting right now. He had very little formal education, and when he became a teenager, his father, who was a poor blacksmith, decided to move to northern Mississippi, actually southeast of Memphis, Tennessee, in the area of Salem. But they hadn't been there that long when his father died. Now, Bedford Forrest was the oldest son. He had a twin sister. And so from the time he was 14, he was taking care of his family. Well, after a couple of years, his mother remarried, and so he accepted a job with his uncle in Hernando, Mississippi, horse trading. His uncle ran into a problem with debts, and four people came basically to collect their debts from the uncle, but saw Bedford out there, who worked for his uncle, and started shooting at him. A bystander threw him a pistol, and he managed to wound three of the attackers while getting wounded himself and drive the other one off. Well, he inherited the business because his uncle was killed, and he was successful as a horse trader, but branched out into slave trading because it was much more lucrative. He moved to Memphis, was very successful there, was elected alderman twice, and made enough money to where he bought a couple of plantations in Mississippi. Now, you may remember that Tennessee actually did not join the seceding states right away. In fact, they voted against doing that. But after Fort Sumter and President Lincoln's call for volunteers, they revisited the issue and this time voted 2-1 to secede and join the South. The day of the vote, Forrest enlisted as a private in a cavalry company. However, him being a prominent citizen and very wealthy, the governor of Tennessee decided to give him a warrant. Says, hey, I will make you a lieutenant colonel if you raise a cavalry battalion. Well, he was very successful at raising a battalion. In fact, half of his troops came from Alabama, but he managed to pull a battalion together and train them at the Memphis Fairgrounds. In October, he was sent north to Tennessee and into Kentucky, and he patrolled forward of the Confederate lines in Kentucky during that period. And that's when, of course, he had his first combat there at a place called Sacramento. In February of 1862, he was ordered to Fort Donelson to take charge of the cavalry there. He took part in several actions around Donelson, but when the people in charge decided to surrender, he requested permission and received it to evacuate instead. He escaped to Nashville and was promptly put in charge there, where he evacuated a bunch of supplies and saved them for the Confederacy. He and his men were sent on leave for 30 days with the understanding they would enlist more people. And so when they came back after 30 days, they had enough for an entire regiment. So he became a colonel and a regimental commander. He fought at Shiloh on the right flank. He reinforced the attack, did a reconnaissance that evening, and helped sustain the line on the second day. But of course, the decision had been made to withdraw. The day after Shiloh, something interesting happened. It was called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Sherman was told to pursue the retreating Confederates. Well, he ran into Forrest. Sherman saw some cavalry ahead, disposed a regiment of infantry and some cavalry in front of him, and it had rained the night before pretty severely, and the infantry fell unorganized, crossing a little stream. That's when Forrest struck with 300 cavalrymen, panicked the infantry, who turned and ran, panicked the cavalry, and there was Sherman. The only time they ever actually faced each other on the field of battle. Sherman, after the war, said, well, if Forrest hadn't already fired off all his ammunition, my career would have ended right there. But Forrest had fired up all his ammunition, and in fact was wounded right after that. So he had to convalesce. And then he returned to the army around Corinth a month later. They did some patrolling. But meanwhile, there was trouble elsewhere. There was a need for a cavalry general to take charge in the Chattanooga area. Forrest was selected and sent to Chattanooga. Now, let me explain the situation at that time. What we had was, I'm going to highlight some of this. We had, by this time, the Confederate Army under Bragg, as Beauregard had been relieved, had retreated from Corinth down to Tupelo, Mississippi. Edmund Kirby Smith was in charge in East Tennessee. He had 5,000 people in Chattanooga and 5,000 in Knoxville. On the northern side, we had Grant with his entire army split between Memphis and Corinth in this area. Grant was given a mission by Halleck, who had moved now to Washington and was in charge of all the armies, to take Vicksburg. But he had a problem. This is July in Mississippi. His troops were mostly from the north, not acclimated, and he thought the better part of valor was to wait for cool weather. So Grant stayed in the area of the Memphis to Corinth area. Meanwhile, General Buell, with his army, was given the mission of restoring the Memphis and Charleston Railroad and the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad and move forward to seize Chattanooga and eventually Knoxville. So that was the overall situation. Now, what happened then was that Chattanooga, as I said, was only defended by 5,000 people. 40,000, more than 40,000 people in Buell's army were headed that way. But it was taking Buell some time. Part of that 5,000 defenders were Confederate cavalry, but they were in disarray. The colonels were squabbling at each other, saying, well, I should be in charge. I have data rank on you. No, I have data rank on you, so forth and so on. Forrest came in, took over, organized a brigade of 3 regiments, and Grant, remember, is sort of stymied. So Bragg looks at the situation and says, you know, if I move and Grant stays there, I can leave a little bit here to stay in front of him, but I'm going to take most of my army to Chattanooga and save Chattanooga, which was important because it's a major rail connection, and possibly defeat Buell. But I'm in Tupelo, Mississippi, and the way I have to get there is to go from Tupelo all the way down to Mobile, take the cross the river there, and then take the trains to Montgomery, Alabama, to Atlanta, and to Chattanooga. That's going to take me at least a month. So Bragg and Kirby Smith are talking, and Kirby Smith turns to Forrest. Forrest was not yet, his promotion had not yet been confirmed, so he's still called a colonel. And this is the order he was given, or this is how it was explained to Richmond. Colonel Forrest, with 3 regiments of cavalry, was sent into Middle Tennessee. He will, I trust, delay Buell's movement till Bragg's columns make their appearance. Think about that. 3 regiments of cavalry, and there's 40,000 men headed your way. But that was his mission. So Forrest scoots behind the closest Union forces, which are less than 30 miles from Chattanooga. He crosses the Cumberland Plateau, a very rugged but unguarded area, and jumps on the Nashville and Chattanooga, actually closer or fairly close to Nashville, only 30 miles away. It had a stockpile of supplies. It was going to be Buell's main supply route. And the Union combat forces were further south. Furthermore, the area was solidly Confederate, so he could expect a lot of local help. There was one other aspect that Forrest probably wasn't aware of, but Confederate cavalry colonels weren't the only ones squabbling over who was in charge. There were 2 infantry regiments of the Union Army, the 3rd Minnesota, which actually was camped up here, and the 9th Michigan, which was camped here. And the colonels didn't get along, so they were split up. Well, Forrest came running in the early morning hours before dawn. He sent some of his forces against the 9th Michigan, sent some forward to the Union camp up there to delay them, and concentrated on taking downtown because there were a bunch of Confederate prisoners there that he wanted to free. Well, it took a while to do all that, but finally he managed to free the prisoners who were holed up by their guards in the courthouse, and Forrest had no artillery, so it took a while to get them out of there. Then he combined his forces, except for a small screen, and went after the Michigan guys here, while Colonel Lester of the 3rd Minnesota went forward a little bit and then was intimidated and stopped there. So Forrest managed to get Colonel Parkhurst of the Michigan boys to surrender. Then he sends a messenger to Lester, wants him to surrender. Well, Lester wants to talk to Parkhurst. So they have a flag of truce, and somehow, even though Forrest had only about 1,500 people, Lester saw a whole lot of Confederate cavalry around there. And talking to Parkhurst, who had been wounded or had been wounded there, and his men had already surrendered, he decided to surrender too. So there were about 120 Union killed and wounded, 1,200 captured, 4 artillery pieces captured, 50 wagons. Forrest lost less than 100 men. Now, the interesting thing is, anybody else would have said, hey, we did a great job. Let's get out of here before they concentrate against us. But remember, Forrest's mission was to delay the advance of Buell for an entire month. So he retired from Murfreesboro over to McMinnville. That is, Murfreesboro was here. He went to McMinnville, rested for a few days, and then launched another raid all the way to the outskirts of Nashville, burning railroad bridges and a railway station, killed 10 Union soldiers, wounded over a dozen, captured 97, no Confederate casualties. It took a week to replace the railroad bridges, and many of Buell's forces were diverted back up to try to track him down. So he still stayed back there. Now he got forced to retreat, and what he had to do was move a little further east all the way to Crossville. And Buell finally got his act back together and started consolidating his forces down here to move on Chattanooga, deciding to ignore Forrest. Well, Forrest launched on yet another raid with this idea of capturing supplies and knocking out a wagon train. This raid did not do well. He ended up losing a significant number of people in several attacks and actually getting ambushed by some of Thomas's guys right here. But again, he distracted Buell's army. Meanwhile, we're talking late August now. And guess what? Bragg is marching north through the Sequatchie Valley. Forrest has delayed Buell long enough for Bragg to make that immense move and take the initiative. Now, so I'm just going to summarize here what happened. Before Murfreesboro, Buell had 40,000 guys, over 10,000 within 30 miles of Chattanooga. There are only 5,000 defenders there. The closest reinforcements 90 miles away. The railroads were ready to supply Buell's offensive by 12th of July. Bragg didn't even leave Tupelo for Chattanooga until July 21st. Yet the delay in that Forrest caused Buell meant that Bragg could get into position, and Chattanooga did not fall until the 9th of September of 1863, over a year later. So my conclusion is Forrest prolonged the war in the West, which was the decisive theater of war, with his persisting threat. Remember, he stayed behind enemy lines. He did prolong the war for possibly up to a year. Now, after that, Bragg went north into Kentucky, as did Kirby Smith. But Bragg basically took Forrest's men away from him, gave them to Joe Wheeler, and sent Forrest back to Tennessee to recruit and train more men. Forrest got with Breckinridge in Murfreesboro. They threatened Nashville, but couldn't really do much. And so by December, as Bragg has marched back from the failure of his invasion, Forrest had a partially trained and ill-equipped brigade of just over 2,000 men, and they were over in Columbia, Tennessee. But let's go back to the situation again. Remember old General Grant sitting over there in Memphis? Now we're talking November. Cooler weather. It's time to head to Vicksburg. So Grant sends his main army and accompanies it down through Mississippi towards Vicksburg. He also sends a diversion with Sherman, actually on riverboats down this way. He protects his supply line, which is, I suppose I should use that old pointer. The supply line goes from Columbus, Kentucky, down the railroad with a major depot at Holly Springs right here. So Pemberton, who's now in charge in this area, starts screaming for help from Bragg. Help, I need some people, because Grant is in position to take Vicksburg very soon. Meanwhile, Bragg's sitting up here at Murfreesboro. Buell got fired and sent home. So now Rosecrans is in charge, and he's in Nashville. And Forrest is sitting over here in Columbia, trying to train his men. Well, in spite of a protest, when Bragg gets Pemberton's note, I gotta have help, he says, he tells Forrest, be prepared to move to West Tennessee and operate against the supply lines. Forrest protested, my men are poorly trained. We don't even have caps for our rifles and our shotguns. Well, Bragg thought about that a moment and said, sent this order, cross rapidly into West Tennessee. You can read the rest of it, but wants to destroy the depots, lines of communication, capturing the guards, and frustrate Grant's campaign. now commencing against Mississippi. Those were Forrest's orders. Now think about that for a minute. We're talking December of 1862 now. He has to cross the Tennessee River, which is a formidable water barrier, patrolled by Union gunboats, go up against 10,000 soldiers protecting that supply line in West Tennessee, destroy the supply line. I don't think Bragg actually expected him to come back from that. But anyway, Forrest did so. Over a period of about 18 days, he crossed the river, fought several small engagements, bluffed Sullivan of the 10,000 men into consolidating everybody in Jackson, Tennessee, tore the railroad up in all these areas, threatened Columbus, and then when they finally figured out he's only got a couple of thousand people here and started pursuing, he started headed back. Well, the pursuing infantry brigades ended up splitting, so Forrest decided to take advantage and attacked one and had them almost surrendering down here when the other one came up from behind him and surprised him. He had actually sent some people to give him early warning, but they had gotten lost. Didn't happen. So the major battle was Parker's Crossroads here, where Forrest lost around 400 people, 300 of them prisoners. But the total number of prisoners he took was over 1,000, 1,300 casualties. But the interesting thing was he absolutely destroyed the railroad right here. This is the Obion River, and there was a causeway across it of several miles, and it was swamp. It took them over 6 months to fix that causeway. He destroyed Grant's supply line. Simultaneously, Van Dorn had gotten that depot at Holly Springs, and Morgan had damaged the L&N Railroad in Kentucky. So in sum, if you read Grant's memoirs, he stated, at the same time, and that's the same time as Van Dorn's raid, Forrest got on a line of railroad between Jackson and Columbus. This cut me off from all communication with the North for over a month, demonstrated the impossibility of maintaining so line of road over which to draw supplies. I determined, therefore, to abandon my campaign into the interior. Vicksburg did not fall for 6 more months. Now, in 1863, Forrest fought under Wheeler and Van Dorn, as I say, in both senses of the term. He defeated Strait's raid. He protected Bragg's left during the Tullahoma campaign, then was sent to the right. Fought the Battle of Chattanooga. He did miss a big opportunity here because he was in position to delay Granger, or actually Steedman's division, at a critical time on the second day of Chickamauga. But his men were fought out. They had actually been fighting his infantry for 2 days and had fought cavalry the day before. So his attempt to delay Steedman's division was ineffective, and that division arrived to reinforce Thomas 15 minutes before Longstreet's attack that would have cut Thomas off. Such happens. Of course, Forrest didn't know what was happening on the other end of the battlefield, but he did miss an opportunity. After that, Bragg took all of Forrest's men again and gave them to Wheeler to raid the communications of Rosecrans, who had to retreat into Chattanooga. And that caused some consternation to Forrest, and actually he tried to resign, says, "You're not going to use me." But instead, he was sent with 300 men to Mississippi to recruit more people and lead them against West Tennessee and northern Mississippi, the Union forces there. Well, he was able to recruit and get assigned to him various cavalry units of 3,000 people in that area. Okay. In February of 1864, Sherman is sitting over here in Vicksburg. He has 21,000 infantrymen. There are 5,000 cavalrymen under Suey Smith in Memphis, and 2,000 more, a brigade of 2,000 more, coming to join him. Sherman has this idea. He says, you know what I would like to do is I would like to attack General Polk over here, who at that time was in Jackson with only 10,000 men, and I will drive him. I want Smith to bring his cavalry down and join me in Meridian. Meanwhile, taking time to burn out the Mississippi Prairie region here, which was a very rich agricultural region. Join me on the 10th of February in Meridian. And if things look good, we're going to keep going east, and we will destroy the Black Belt of Alabama, burn the munitions factories, armor plate, and cannon factories in Selma, and then cut loose from the railroad, come down behind the Mobile fortifications and take Mobile. Sherman also arranged for a couple of other things to divert Confederate attention. So at this time, Forrest had about 3,500 effectives mounted and armed. So the trouble was, Smith, although he already had 5,000, waited several days for that last brigade to bump him up to 7,000. And then when he started moving slowly, because apparently he was very afraid of Forrest. In spite of his earlier bluster about Forrest doesn't want to fight, it looked like Smith didn't want to fight. Well, he got down to the prairie to a place called West Point, north of Starkville. And Forrest was in front of him, behind a very deep creek. And Forrest had troops to his left, behind the Tombigbee River. And troops to his right, behind another river. So Smith looked and said, well, I'm too late to get to meet Sherman, and I'm surrounded on three sides. You know, I think we ought to go home. Well, Forrest was in contact. He started a vigorous pursuit. He caught up with him. He hit the rear guard several times. He caught up with the main force at Okolona. Now, part of the force was already retreating north from Okolona, but Grierson had set a trap by hiding his people in the small town of Oklahoma and letting the rear guard pass through, and was hoping that Forrest would commit and Grierson could hit him hard when Forrest was hitting the rear guard. But Forrest detected it, didn't fall for it. And then Grierson looked around and said, well, you know, the rest of the guys are retreating. I guess Forrest isn't going to fall for it. We need to go. So he started pulling out, and that's when Forrest hit him. He routed the retreating units. It had taken Suey Smith 10 days to reach West Point, Mississippi from Memphis. It took him 3 days to get back to Memphis. There really weren't a whole lot of losses. A little artillery, Smith about 380, Forrest about 145, but that included his brother Jeffrey. But what happened was Forrest's fearsome reputation, that's all you can call it, delayed Smith. The Union columns were unable to merge. Sherman said, well, without cavalry, I'm going to have to just go back to Vicksburg. What did that do? That spared the agricultural regions of the Prairie and the Black Belt, the armaments factories, and Mobile for over a year. Now, as a side note, why do you think that the agricultural regions of the Prairie and the Black Belt, that is Mississippi and Alabama, were that important. I mean, there weren't that many Confederates there. Well, interesting story about the commissary department in Richmond. You know, Joe Johnston had over 40,000 troops trying to defend Georgia. Yet the commissary department had assigned all of the produce of Georgia to the Army of Northern Virginia. So Joe Johnston was not authorized and had no commissary officers in Georgia. Even though he was defending it, he couldn't draw his supplies from Georgia. He had to draw his food from Mississippi and Alabama. And that's why those agricultural regions were so important. Okay, so fast forward a couple of months, Forrest has embarked on a new raid against various posts in West Tennessee and even up into Kentucky. He wanted to get a change of clothing for his guys, fresh horses, food, and more recruits. The Mississippi troops stayed in Mississippi and swept looking for deserters in the area between where they were stationed and the Tallahatchie River. And then they were to man an outpost line, okay? Now, Forrest took several raids. The first one was Union City. He wasn't actually present. He sent the 7th Tennessee, Confederate States of America, to Union City, where the 7th Tennessee Cavalry, United States of America, was stationed. Well, the 7th Tennessee Confederate ran a little bluff on the 7th Tennessee Union and said, we've got all the Forrest people here and you all have surrendered, and they did. It's a funny story, but it had an unfortunate consequence, because what happened was the story was too good to be held, and everybody, Union and Confederate, heard, yeah, Forrest just bluffed these guys and he had equal strength. Then Forrest himself took his people up to Paducah to seize supply. Now, Fort Anderson on the riverbank, protected by gunboats and a very heavy fort, did not fall at that time. Forrest didn't really try. He knew he couldn't take it, and so he just gathered supplies. But unfortunately, one of his regiments was a Paducah regiment, and the commander decided to give Fort Anderson a try, which cost him his own life within sight of his house where his family was. But there was not a serious attack. But of course, the Union colonel commanding in Paducah wrote it up, hey, we beat off Forrest's attack. All you have to do is stand strong. So anyway, after those two raids, Forrest started recruiting men, getting horses, had some skirmishes, no battles. He got a Paducah newspaper where the newspaper was bragging, well, Forrest and his men missed all these horses, that we hid them in this factory. So he sent Buford back up there, and they got the horses this time. Meanwhile, though, he decided to strike one more blow before returning to Mississippi. Now, why would he return to Mississippi? Because his people, his forces now, were feeding off the countryside. And remember, this is spring, which is kind of a time of the year where the crops, not many crops have come in yet. So he kind of skint the area, to use his terminology. So he needed to return back to Mississippi. However, some of the prominent citizens in that area were complaining about the Union cavalry, which had murdered some people. They were accused of having raped some people. They were burning barns and stealing cotton, which was very lucrative. And they were stationed in a place called Fort Pillow. So Forrest promised, I'll go take care of that place. Now, Fort Pillow was on the bank of the Mississippi. It's not anymore. The Mississippi changed a little bit, but it was under a guy named Colonel Booth. All right. Now, he actually manned a battery here. The troops lived in these shacks, and his 13th Tennessee, who are the ones that were doing all the raiding and everything, manned the inner works out here. Sherman had actually directed that Fort Pillow be abandoned. He was disobeyed by his subordinate in Memphis at the time because of that cotton deal. There's a lot of cotton smuggling going on, and that was the center of it. Some of these wagons that went out were actually planters had sold cotton. Some of it was cotton was stolen, and cotton was a very high premium in the North. So certain people were making money, and that's why the post actually stayed there. So anyway, the first to arrive, first Confederates to arrive there was Chalmers' division. When Chalmers got there, he unfortunately the pickets warned him, so that the 13th Tennessee occupied the inner works, and the U.S. colored troops occupied the battery here. Chalmers was out here. When Forrest arrived, he rode around and did a recon of the entire position, and he found that it was very vulnerable. During that recon, he actually got 3 horses shot from under him. One of them fell on him and injured him, shook him up more than a severe injury. So he ordered Chalmers to take the inner works. Well, it didn't take much. The 13th Tennessee knew they were outnumbered, and as soon as an attack went forward, they ran down the trail, which went this way, and reinforced the battery up here. Now, this is very steep back behind the battery. So the Confederates moved forward. Now, notice how dissected the terrain is. They were able to get very close. In fact, McCulloch moved all the way up to this area right here without being shot at by the people in the battery because of the gullies and the hillsides and the way it was all shaped. So they were very close. Also, Forrest had the sharpshooters get on the high ground here, 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 and here. And some of that high ground was actually higher than the battery position. So these sharpshooters were firing into the battery. There were no headlogs in the battery, so if someone in the battery wanted to shoot back, they had to stick their head up over and, of course, were quite vulnerable. Booth, the commander, was actually killed fairly early in the fight by one of these snipers. So, mid-afternoon, Forrest sends in a flag of truce, says, hey, I've got you, basically, surrender. The guys inside, there was another major that had taken charge, were playing for time because there was a Union gunboat that had been bombarding rather ineffectually, and there were Union troop ships out on the river, and he was hoping that they would come to his rescue. But Forrest had already put a couple of detachments here and over here to stop that from happening. One Union boat came in and then had to sheer off because of the rifle fire. So then the guy in the fort, he was remembering the stories. He said, you know, we had that colonel of the 7th Tennessee got shamed because he surrendered to a bluff. And then up in Paducah, it turned out to be a bluff, and the guy lived. I think this is a bluff, even though he'd already sustained a significant number of casualties from the sharpshooters and from the small fight up here. So he refused to surrender. So Forrest, who had come up as far as here, went back around to the high ground right here with his bugler and sent out messengers to everyone. When you hear the bugle, attack and overrun the position. That's what happened. There were very heavy casualties, many more so on the Union side, some of them caused by war crimes. In particular, some of the surrendering Union soldiers tried to surrender and were shot down in cold blood. Now, this was not ordered by anyone, and Forrest himself was actually up here, although as soon as the bugle blew, he rode back down the trail and back up here towards it. He entered the fort 10 minutes later, by which time it had fallen. A lot of the people in the battery had thought, because this has been coordinated before, that the gunboat would protect them. If they ran down the slope, then the gunboat could stop any pursuit. But they didn't know that Forrest already had detachments down here, so they ran into a crossfire. So as a result, anyway, there was very heavy casualties on the Union side. Confederate casualties were about 100. The Union casualties were really about 400 some odd, some killed and some captured and some marched away. So anyway, there were over 200 captured, over 100 wounded. Now the wounded were released to Union steamers and sent home. So we can say that there were between, say, 280 and 300 either killed, drowned, or escaped. And these were disproportionately U.S. colored troops. All right. Now what happened? Well, of course, there was a big brouhaha and an investigation. The people that testified were these 100 wounded who had been put on steamers. And they made allegations that there was torture. That was never substantiated. It was certainly true that people were killed after they tried to surrender, after they did surrender. We don't know how many, what proportion of the 300 fell into that. It probably was a couple of dozen. It could have been as many as 50. It probably wasn't over that, because they were all, remember, this firing and battle had taken place all the day before that. So anyway, that's what happened. But what happened then, of course, the congressional investigation gathered a lot of publicity, and it was used as a campaign issue. Of course, there were no witnesses for the defense, as you might imagine, but at the end, 40,000 copies of the rather large report were printed and sent to all the electoral districts in the Union. It was used to attempt to enrage people, to spur enlistment, and to enrage people against the South to continue the war. And that was the key part of what happened. The U.S. colored troops that had survived vowed revenge, and they fought harder subsequently. And of course, this added greatly to racial animosity, which even extends to this day, as many of you are aware of. So, well, after that, Forrest is back in Mississippi. The Sherman in May decided to attack Johnston and take Atlanta. But as he wrote to General McPherson, one of his subordinates, the most we have to fear is that Forrest gets on our supply lines. So what Sherman arranged was for mounted expeditions out of Memphis into Mississippi. And 3 of them were mounted. The first one was stunningly defeated at Bryce's Crossroads. Forrest was outnumbered over 2 to 1, and he virtually destroyed Sam Sturgis and his expedition, captured almost all their artillery. The second one was met by S.D. Lee and Forrest together, Lee being Forrest's supervisor. And it was a defeat. Lee had ordered an attack over Forrest's desires, because Lee was also worried about Mobile and was trying to get some of his troops back there. But the attack was so vigorous that A.J. Smith, who had conducted the Union raid, retreated anyway. Sherman wasn't happy, and he said, get some more troops and go back. Well, he went back. Meanwhile, Forrest had lost some of his people to protect Alabama. So Forrest used a very interesting indirect approach. He left half of his troops in front of Smith just to delay him, which wasn't too hard because Smith was rebuilding the railway south, and took the other half and raided Memphis. He wasn't expecting anything. And of course, Memphis was where A.J. Smith's headquarters was and where his boss was. And so Forrest was trying to capture the generals. He didn't catch Washburn, who was the boss there, but he did capture his uniform. Washburn made it to a fort in his nightshirt. He didn't capture Hobart, who had been the earlier commander at Memphis, who had been working the cotton deal. But I got to say, Hobart had the absolute best line of the whole war. After this was over, he was heard to say, "Well, they relieved me from command in Memphis because I couldn't keep Forrest out of West Tennessee, but Washburn can't even keep him out of his own bedroom." So anyway, that was, I thought that was one of the best lines that had ever came out of the Civil War. The raid on Memphis worked. A.J. Smith tried to send Grierson to stop Forrest, but he sent him the wrong way because they had a bad indication. And then Grierson said, "My cavalry's worn down." Smith was tired of his raid, and so he retreated back. But in the last analysis, Sherman's strategy worked. His supply lines remained secure, and Forrest lost a lot of people. His horses were run down because of all that. So Sherman takes Atlanta. No more raids out of Memphis. So Forrest has said, "Well, go take Sherman's supply lines." Show them in the map here. You've got the L&N down here. You've got the Cumberland River here. You've got the Nashville and Northwestern here to the Tennessee River. And then you've got two lines south, one to Decatur, which turns and goes to Chattanooga, and one directly from Nashville to Chattanooga. So Forrest is told, go take out the supply line. He takes out the Tennessee and Alabama, but by this time, Atlanta was taken, and Sherman could spare enough troops to heavily guard this line, and Forrest couldn't do anything against it. So Forrest comes back, and he actually requests leave. He says, "Me and my men are really tired." He ended up back in Corinth, and by this time his boss is Richard Taylor, and Taylor says, "No, we've got to go again. You need to stop the Tennessee River supply line." This was fall, of course, and the Cumberland River was now too low to support supply vessels there. And there were still Confederate raids up here on the L&N, so the main supply route was the Tennessee River to this railroad. So Forrest gets up there, knocks out some river boats, destroys the Johnsonville depot, but it's too late for a major impact. And now his men and horses are in really bad shape. But Hood's brilliant idea is to leave Sherman where he is in Atlanta, and I'm going to go to Nashville. So he goes all the way over to Florence, Alabama, and waits for Forrest, puts him in charge of the cavalry. All right, they move north towards Nashville. They can't cut off the Union forces. Hood loses a lot of his people at Franklin. He sends Forrest over to Murfreesboro with infantry division of about 3,000 men and half of his own cavalry, which was another 3,000. But Murfreesboro now has 60 heavy guns and somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 men, so Forrest can't do anything there. Hood, sitting on the outskirts of Nashville, is defeated by Thomas, starts retreating. Forrest gets the word, joins them down in Columbia, Tennessee, and covers the retreat from then on. Hood's army is by now just a mob running away, but Forrest is able to keep Thomas's pursuit totally off of the army, and Hood's army, his artillery and his wagons are able to make it back across the Tennessee River, back into Alabama and northern Mississippi. So Then it's wintertime. Wilson, who had actually been defeated by Forrest earlier during the Nashville campaign, builds up a cavalry corps of 15,000 in northern Alabama. Forrest is put in charge of all the cavalry in Alabama and Mississippi and eastern Louisiana. That's 10,000 cavalry. But unfortunately, he has multiple threat axes. He's got to cover Baton Rouge. He's got to cover Vicksburg. He's got to cover Memphis. He's got to cover Wilson in North Alabama. And he's got to cover Logan in Huntsville, Alabama. So his forces are dispersed. Not only to do that, but because it's wintertime and he has to disperse his men to be able to feed his men and horses off the countryside. If they put them all in one place, the transportation and the forage there could not support them. So anyway, Wilson starts moving south in March. Forrest tries to gather his forces to meet him. One of his divisions is unable to get there at all. Wilson captures Forrest's orders. It outlines what's going to happen, so he's able to burn a vital bridge. So Forrest tries to defend Selma with 2,500 of his men and some militia against what was at that time now down to about 9,000 cavalry with repeating rifles. That did not work. Wilson takes Selma and Montgomery, continues into Georgia. Forrest reconstitutes his force on the west side in West Alabama and ends up surrendering in May of 1865 at the direction of Richard Taylor. So anyway, let me summarize. I think there are 4 key points where Forrest made a difference. In Murfreesboro, he extended the war and its decisive theater for up to a year by keeping Buell from taking Chattanooga. Later on that year in West Tennessee, and in combination with Van Dorn's raid, he stymied Grant's Vicksburg campaign by 4 to 6 months. 1864, he prevented Smith from joining Sherman in Meridian, sparing the agricultural products of Mississippi and Alabama for Johnston's army, and sparing Selma for up to a year. And of course, Fort Pillow. The war crimes and the stories out of that may have shortened the war. It certainly sustained Northern will and increased sectional and racial hatred. So, certainly, he made a difference in the duration, if not the outcome of the war, and also certainly in its aftermath. Now, a little advertising. I have a book on the battles and campaigns of Forrest. Is printed in 2017, just 3 years ago, less than 3 years ago. And you can read about it. I've got order battle information, 109 maps and driving directions, as well as references. You can see one of the maps. That's actually where they were taking on the river boats during the Johnsonville campaign. And you can see the text on the right-hand side there. Part of it is shaded. Those are literally your driving directions. All right, it's for sale, normally $20. You know, if I'm giving this in person, I'll sell it to you for $20. It costs somewhere around that on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. If you want an autographed copy, you can visit my website at www.johnrscales.com. Click on the email link, email me directly at scalesjr@aol.com, and I'll send you instructions. It'll cost about $25 because I got to package it up and send it. Or an easy way to get it is Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And you enter my name, John R. Scales, and my stuff should pop up. You'll actually see 3 books. One is Sherman Invades Georgia. One of them is about World War II, and one of them is this book. And I do have a 4th one, which will be out soon, I hope. So But that one's a Tom Clancy thing set in the future, so it's not for the Civil War books. Anyway, that's it. So what are your questions?